So there's one problem with this code, which is it's not very general. It's hard to reuse this image cycler, and if I want to have multiple image cyclers on the same page, I can't really do that. It's kind of hard coded for this set of images and these two buttons and this image display tag. So let's go ahead and make it a little more general and reusable. So I'm going to start by passing these things in as parameters. So instead of having an animal images constant, I'm going to go ahead and pass in an images param, which is going to be an array. And then instead of using document.getElementById by ID animal to find the tag, I'm going to pass in an HTML element for the image tag. And instead of adding the click handler to document.getElementById by ID ink, I'm going to pass in an ink tag. Let's call it an ink clickable, and also a deck clickable. So now it's going to take 4 parameters. So let's go ahead and find animal images everywhere and change that to images. And I'm going to start filling this out. We'll come back to this in a sec, but let's go and say image cycler, and then images is going to be this array here. And then get rid of that entirely. And then this image tag, that's going to be the second parameter. So we'll pass that in. And then this ink clickable, that's going to be the third parameter. And then this deck clickable, that's going to be the fourth parameter. And let's go ahead and make this a little neater. So here's how I like to write parameter lists if they're too long. And then we'll close off the call to image cycler. And there's a statement. So if I call this function, that will do the same thing as I was doing before and init the image cycler. But if I just call this at top level like I have here, it's not going to work because the page isn't fully loaded when this code gets run yet. And so I'm going to get an error that cannot set source property of null. It's basically trying to set the source of the image tag, but the image tag doesn't exist yet. Image tag only is guaranteed to exist down here where the window is finished loading. So really, I want to put this call here instead, but that's not going to work because this is still going to happen at load time. So let's go ahead and see what happens if I do that. Yeah, still doesn't work. So what I really want to do, and what I've done before, is put this inside of a function that gets executed when the window is loaded. So function, like so, and then it's going to execute that piece of code. There's my call to image cycler closed off. And there's the parameter list for add event listener closed off. So this should work. Oh, and I have a little syntax error. So let's check my parens. So image cycler is closed there. Oh, I need to close off the function and then close off the parameter list. Okay, so still an error, cannot set source property of null. So let's see when this is actually getting called. Oh, I need to Let me put a breakpoint right there, reload. So image is null. I'm getting called from update, called from image cycler, which is getting called. Oh, and I forgot to take out that call. Okay, so fix that, and now it should work. I have to remove my breakpoint. So image is bound, so that's correct, and it works. Now my buttons aren't working, so let's see what's going on with those. So I'll put a breakpoint there and reload. So I'm getting here. My clickable is a button, and I'm adding counter.inc, which is a function. So that's my inc button, and here's my deck button. So that looks good. So let's go ahead and put a breakpoint. I probably forgot to update one of these image references. So let me put a breakpoint right here and click next, see if I got there, and I did. So I have the right tag. Index is 1. Count is 1. Count is still 1. Oh, it updated and then it changed back. Okay, so next is getting called from inc, and then is getting called from deck. Oh, I have the wrong. I'm passing in inc twice instead of passing in inc and deck. So let me fix that. That should be deck for deck clickable. Okay, so get rid of the breakpoint and it should all work. Great. So that works, but this expression is a little long and complicated, and I can do the same thing using something called partial evaluation with a bind operator. So let me show you how that works. So if I hit F12 and go to the console, I'm going to go ahead and define a really simple function. So let's say function add, and that's going to take A and B, and it's going to return A plus B. So now I can say add 2 and 3, and it returns 5, or 2 and 6, and it returns 8, or whatever, 3 and 6. Now, functions are objects in JavaScript, as I've said many times, and objects have methods, and functions have some built-in methods as well. So one of the ones that we've seen before is call. So I can say add.call. And if add was a property on an object, the first parameter would be the object that I want to run this method on. So, so if there's an add method, for example, on a particular object class, and I want to call that on an object, I can pass in the object here, and it's exactly like running the method on that object. But I don't want to use this as a method here. I just want to use it as a regular plain old function. So I'm going to pass in null for the first parameter. I'm not running it on any object. And then I specify the value of the two parameters, 5 and 6. And I get exactly the same result as if I called add 5, 6. So this hopefully is pretty straightforward. Whatever you pass into add.call gets passed right to a function call, and then the return result is returned from add.call. Now, there's also something called bind. So add.bind behaves a lot like add.call. It takes the same parameters, null, comma, 5, comma, 6, except that instead of calling add on 5 and 6, what bind is going to do is it's going to bind 5 and 6 to the parameters of add and then return a new function without those parameters anymore. So it's like creating a closure. So I'm going to go ahead and say var add 5 and 6 is equal to this result. And now add 5 and 6 is actually a function. Console.dir add 5 and 6. If I open it up, you'll see that the arguments is now complicated. The length of the parameter list is 0 because this doesn't take any parameters anymore. I've used both parameters in the bind. I've bound values to both parameters. And you'll see that there's an implementation dependent property called boundargs that has an array with two values in it. So it's bound up that parameter 0 is 5 and parameter 1 is 2, and the two parameters are bound. There are no parameters left. So if I call that function, add 5 and 6, it returns 11. So just like add 5 comma 6, that returns 11. Calling this function also returns 11. And I can do the same thing here. I can say add 2 and 3 is add.bind null comma 2 comma 3. And now I have a function that when you run it returns 5, just like calling add 2 and 3. So this may not seem like a huge deal, but you can also do something called partial binding. So let's say I want to declare a function var add1, which is equal to add.bind null to 1. Now I have a function where one of the parameters is bound to 1, but then the second parameter is still a parameter that I can pass arguments to. So add 1 to 3, I get 4. Add 1 to 3, add 1 to 6, I get 7, and so on. Or I can make a var add 6, which is add.bind null to 6. Here, the first parameter is bound to 6, and so if I say add 6 to 1, I get 7, or add 6 to 7, I get 13. So what this lets me do is partially bind the parameters, partially evaluate this function, and then save the intermediate results as a function that I can use as a callback to pass in later. So what that lets me do is I can specify the first parameter here anytime, because this is a constant value that is never changing even before these document elements exist. So I'm going to go ahead and reorder this code. Instead of calling image cycler, I'm going to image cycler dot bind null comma that. So I've matched the first parameter and then move that out and say var image cycler for animals is equal to that. So I've taken image cycler, which is now generic, and I've created an animal image cycler by binding it to an array of animal images. And then in this window.add event listener on load, here I can call my image cycler animals function on the tags when the tags exist. So this lets me separate the content that I'm displaying from the controller that's actually letting me cycle through the images. So let's go ahead and reload, and it should work exactly the same. It does. But let's say I have another set of images. So let's go ahead and grab some electrical components. So let's go in a separate window. So let's go ahead and grab, I don't even know what I'm doing here, but some integrated circuits. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and save image as ics.jpg. And we'll go ahead and LEDs. There's some other stuff too, but save image as, let's try it again. Save image as leds.jpg. And I'll get one more. Oh, I like this one. Let's call it art.jpg. Okay, so now I'm going to create another array. Let's call image cycler for electrical components. And this one is going to have images slash ics.jpg, images slash leds.jpg, and images slash art.jpg. Okay, so now I have a animal images cycler and an electrical components images cycler, and that can be a parameter to this function. So we'll go ahead and give it a cycler parameter and then call cycler on whatever gets hooked up. So in order to pass in cycler, I can bind that as well. So let's go ahead and take this thing out here. And paste. And then this whole function, I'm going to bind to image cycler animals. And that's going to return call it animal cycler. function. And then we'll copy that whole thing and call this electronics cycler function. And I'm just going to change that to electrical components, like so. And then for this load, I'll use animal cycler function. And reload, and I should get the animals. And I do. But if I change this to image cycler electrical components, or electronic cycler function, save, reload, and now I get my electronic cycler. So I've used bind to separate out the content, and then I've used bind again to create a function that takes no parameters that I can use as my event listener handler for load.